Chapter 9 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 9. The progress of Catherine's unhappiness from the events of the evening was as follows. It appeared first in a general dissatisfaction with everybody about her, while she remained in the rooms, which speedily brought on considerable weariness and a violent desire to go home. This, on arriving in Pulteney Street, took the direction of extraordinary hunger, and when that was appeased, changed into an earnest longing to be in bed. Such was the extreme point of her distress, for when there she immediately fell into a sound sleep which lasted 9 hours, and from which she awoke perfectly revived, in excellent spirits, with fresh hopes and fresh schemes. The first wish of her heart was to improve her acquaintance with Miss Tilney, and almost her first resolution to seek her for that purpose, in the pump-room at noon. In the pump-room, one so newly arrived in Bath must be met with, and that building she had already found so favourable for the discovery of female excellence, and the completion of female intimacy, so admirably adapted for secret discourses and unlimited confidence, that she was most reasonably encouraged to expect another friend from within its walls. Her plan for the morning thus settled, she sat quietly down to her book after breakfast, resolving to remain in the same place and the same employment till the clock struck 1, and from habitude very little incommoded by the remarks and ejaculations of Mrs. Allen, whose vacancy of mind and incapacity for thinking were such that as she never talked a great deal, so she could never be entirely silent, and therefore while she sat at her work, if she lost her needle or broke her thread, if she heard a carriage in the street, or saw a speck upon her gown, she must observe it aloud, whether there were anyone at leisure to answer her or not. At about 12:30 a remarkably loud rap drew her in haste to the window, and scarcely had she time to inform Catherine of there being 2 open carriages at the door, in the first only a servant, her brother driving Miss Thorpe in the second, before John Thorpe came running upstairs, calling out,
"Well, Miss Morland, here I am. Have you been waiting long? We could not come before. The old devil of a coachmaker was such an eternity finding out a thing fit to be got into, and now it is 10,000 to 1 but they break down before we are out of the street. How do you do, Mrs. Allen? A famous ball last night, wasn't it? Come, Miss Morland, be quick, for the others are in a confounded hurry to be off. They want to get their tumble over."
"What do you mean?"
said Catherine.
"Where are you all going to?"
"Going to? Why, you have not forgot our engagement. Did not we agree together to take a drive this morning? What a head you have! We are going up Claverton Down."
"Something was said about it, I remember,"
said Catherine, looking at Mrs. Allen for her opinion.
"but really I did not expect you."
"Not expect me? That's a good one. And what a dust you would have made if I had not come."
Catherine's silent appeal to her friend, meanwhile, was entirely thrown away, for Mrs. Allen, not being at all in the habit of conveying any expression herself by a look, was not aware of its being ever intended by any one else, and Catherine, whose desire of seeing Miss Tilney again could at that moment bear a short delay in favour of a drive, and who thought there could be no impropriety in her going with Mr. Thorpe, as Isabella was going at the same time with James, was therefore obliged to speak plainer.
"Well, ma'am, what do you say to it? Can you spare me for an hour or 2? Shall I go?"
"Do just as you please, my dear,"
replied Mrs. Allen, with the most placid indifference. Catherine took the advice, and ran off to get ready. In a very few minutes she reappeared, having scarcely allowed the 2 others time enough to get through a few short sentences in her praise, after Thorpe had procured Mrs. Allen's admiration of his gig, and then, receiving her friend's parting good wishes, they both hurried downstairs.
"My dearest creature,"
cried Isabella, to whom the duty of friendship immediately called her before she could get into the carriage.
"you have been at least 3 hours getting ready. I was afraid you were ill. What a delightful ball we had last night. I have 1,000 things to say to you, but make haste and get in, for I long to be off."
Catherine followed her orders and turned away, but not too soon to hear her friend exclaim aloud to James,
"What a sweet girl she is! I quite dote on her."
"You will not be frightened, Miss Morland,"
said Thorpe, as he handed her in.
"If my horse should dance about a little at first, setting off, He will most likely give a plunge or two, and perhaps take the rest for a minute, but he will soon know his master. He is full of spirits, playful as can be, but there is no vice in him."
Catherine did not think the portrait a very inviting one, but it was too late to retreat, and she was too young to own herself frightened. So, resigning herself to her fate, and trusting to the animal's boasted knowledge of its owner, she sat peaceably down, and saw Thorpe sit down by her. Everything being then arranged, the servant who stood at the horse's head was bid in an important voice to
"Let him go."
And off they went in the quietest manner imaginable, without a plunge or a caper or anything like one. Catherine, delighted at so happy an escape, spoke her pleasure aloud with grateful surprise, and her companion immediately made the matter perfectly simple by assuring her that
it was entirely owing to the peculiar judicious manner in which he had then held the reins, and the singular discernment and dexterity with which he had directed his whip.
Catherine, though she could not help wondering that with such perfect command of his horse he should think it necessary to alarm her with relation of its tricks, congratulated herself sincerely on being under the care of so excellent a coachman, and perceiving that the animal continued to go on in the same quiet manner, without showing the smallest propensity toward any unpleasant vivacity, and considering its inevitable pace was 10 miles an hour, by no means alarmingly fast, gave herself up to all the enjoyment of air and exercise of the most invigorating kind, in a fine mild day of February, with the consciousness of safety. A silence of several minutes succeeded their first short dialogue. It was broken by Thorpe's saying very abruptly,
"Old Alan is as rich as a Jew, is not he?"
Catherine did not understand him, and he repeated his question, adding in explanation,
"Old Alan, the man you are with."
Oh, Mr. Allen, you mean? Yes, I believe he is very rich.
"And no children at all?"
No, not any.
"A famous thing for his next heirs. He is your godfather, is not he?"
My godfather? No.
"But you are always very much with them."
Yes, very much.
"Aye, that is what I meant. He seems a good kind of old fellow enough, and has lived very well in his time, I dare say. He is not gouty for nothing. Does he drink his bottle a day now?"
His bottle a day? No. Why should you think of such a thing? He is a very temperate man, and you could not fancy him in liquor last night?
"Lord help you! You women are always thinking of men's being in liquor. Why, you do not suppose a man is overset by a bottle? I am sure of this, that if everybody was to drink their bottle a day, there would not be half the disorders in the world there are now. It would be a famous good thing for us all."
I cannot believe it.
"Oh, Lord, it would be the saving of thousands. There is not the 100th part of the wine consumed in this kingdom that there ought to be. Our foggy climate wants help."
And yet I have heard that there is a great deal of wine drunk in Oxford.
"Oxford? There's no drinking at Oxford now, I assure you. Nobody drinks there. You would hardly meet with a man who goes beyond his 4 pints at the utmost. Now, for instance, it was reckoned a remarkable thing at the last party in my rooms that upon an average we cleared about 5 pints a head. It was looked upon as something out of the common way. Mine is famous good stuff, to be sure. You would not often meet with anything like it in Oxford, and that may account for it. But this will just give you a notion of the general rate of drinking there."
Yes, it does give a notion,
said Catherine warmly.
and that is, that you all drink a great deal more wine than I thought you did. However, I am sure James does not drink so much.
This declaration brought on a loud and overpowering reply, of which no part was very distinct, except the frequent exclamations amounting almost to oaths which adorned it, and Catherine was left, when it ended, with a rather strengthened belief of there being a great deal of wine drunk in Oxford, and the same happy conviction of her brother's comparative sobriety. Thorpe's ideas then all reverted to the merits of his own equipage, and she was called on to admire the spirit and freedom with which his horse moved along, and the ease which his paces, as well as the excellence of the springs, gave the motion of the carriage. She followed him in all his admiration as well as she could. To go before or beyond him was impossible. His knowledge and her ignorance of the subject, his rapidity of expression and her diffidence of herself put that out of her power. She could strike out nothing new in commendation, but she readily echoed whatever he chose to assert, and it was finally settled between them without any difficulty that his equipage was altogether the most complete of its kind in England, his carriage the neatest, his horse the best goer, and himself the best coachman.
You do not really think, Mr. Thorpe,
said Catherine, venturing after some time to consider the matter as entirely decided, and to offer some little variation on the subject,
that James's gig will break down?
Break down? Oh, Lord! Did you ever see such a little titipy thing in your life? There is not a sound piece of iron about it. The wheels have been fairly worn out these 10 years at least, and as for the body, upon my soul, you might shake it to pieces yourself with a touch. It is the most devilish little rickety business I ever beheld. Thank God we have got a better. I would not be bound to go 2 miles in it for £50,000.
Good heavens!
cried Catherine, quite frightened.
Then pray let us turn back. They will certainly meet with an accident if we go on. Do let us turn back, Mr. Thorpe. Stop and speak to my brother, and tell him how very unsafe it is.
Unsafe? Oh, Lord! What is there in that? They will only get a roll if it does break down, and there is plenty of dirt. It will be excellent falling. Oh, curse it! The carriage is safe enough, if a man knows how to drive it. A thing of that sort in good hands will last above 20 years after it is fairly worn out. Lord bless you! I would undertake for £5 to drive it to York and back again without losing a nail.
Catherine listened with astonishment. She knew not how to reconcile two such very different accounts of the same thing, for she had not been brought up to understand the propensities of a rattle, nor to know to how many idle assertions and imprudent falsehoods the excess of vanity will lead. Her own family were plain, matter-of-fact people who seldom aimed at wit of any kind, her father, at the utmost, being contented with a pun, and her mother with a proverb. They were not in the habit, therefore, of telling lies to increase their importance, or of asserting at one moment what they would contradict the next. She reflected on the affair for some time in much perplexity, and was more than once on the point of requesting from Mr. Thorpe a clearer insight into his real opinion on the subject, but she checked herself, because it appeared to her that he did not excel in giving those clearer insights, in making those things plain which he had before made ambiguous, and joining to this the consideration that he would not really suffer his sister and his friend to be exposed to a danger from which he might easily preserve them, she concluded at last that he must know the carriage to be in fact perfectly safe, and therefore would alarm herself no longer. By him the whole matter seemed entirely forgotten, and all the rest of his conversation, or rather talk, began and ended with himself and his own concerns. He told her of horses which he had bought for a trifle and sold for incredible sums, of racing matches in which his judgment had infallibly foretold the winner, of shooting parties in which he had killed more birds, though without having one good shot, than all his companions together, and described to her some famous day's sport with the foxhounds, in which his foresight and skill in directing the dogs had repaired the mistakes of the most experienced huntsman, and in which the boldness of his riding, though it had never endangered his own life for a moment, had been constantly leading others into difficulties, which he calmly concluded had broken the necks of many. Little as Catherine was in the habit of judging for herself, and unfixed as were her general notions of what men ought to be, she could not entirely repress a doubt, while she bore with the effusions of his endless conceit, of his being altogether completely agreeable. It was a bold surmise, for he was Isabella's brother, and she had been assured by James that his manners would recommend him to all her sex, but in spite of this, the extreme weariness of his company, which crept over her before they had been out an hour, and which continued unceasingly to increase till they stopped in Pulteney Street again, induced her in some small degree to resist such high authority, and to distrust his powers of giving universal pleasure. When they arrived at Mrs. Allen's door, the astonishment of Isabella was hardly to be expressed on finding that it was too late in the day for them to attend her friend into the house.
Past 3 o'clock?
It was.
Inconceivable, incredible, impossible.
And she would neither believe her own watch, nor her brother's, nor the servants'. She would believe no assurance of it founded on reason or reality, till Morland produced his watch and ascertained the fact. To have doubted a moment longer then would have been equally inconceivable, incredible, and impossible, and she could only protest over and over again that
no 2 hours and a half had ever gone off so swiftly before.
as Catherine was called on to confirm. Catherine could not tell a falsehood even to please Isabella, but the latter was spared the misery of her friend's dissenting voice by not waiting for her answer. Her own feelings entirely engrossed her. Her wretchedness was most acute on finding herself obliged to go directly home.
It was ages since she had had a moment's conversation with her dearest Catherine, and though she had such thousands of things to say to her, it appeared as if they were never to be together again.
So, with smiles of most exquisite misery, and the laughing eye of utter despondency, she bade her friend adieu, and went on. Catherine found Mrs. Allen just returned from all the busy idleness of the morning, and was immediately greeted with,
"Well, my dear, here you are."
a truth which she had no greater inclination than power to dispute.
"And I hope you have had a pleasant airing."
Yes, ma'am, I thank you. We could not have had a nicer day.
"So Mrs. Thorpe said. She was vastly pleased at your all going."
You have seen Mrs. Thorpe, then?
"Yes, I went to the pump room as soon as you were gone, and there I met her, and we had a great deal of talk together. She says there was hardly any veal to be got at market this morning. It is so uncommonly scarce."
Did you see anybody else of our acquaintance?
"Yes, we agreed to take a turn in the Crescent, and there we met Mrs. Hughes and Mr. and Miss Tilney walking with her."
Did you indeed? And did they speak to you?
"Yes, we walked along the Crescent together for half an hour. They seem very agreeable people. Miss Tilney was in a very pretty spotted muslin, and I fancy, by what I can learn, that she always dresses very handsomely. Mrs. Hughes talked to me a great deal about the family."
And what did she tell you of them?
"Oh, a vast deal indeed. She hardly talked of anything else."
Did she tell you what part of Gloucestershire they come from?
"Yes, she did, but I cannot recollect now. But they are a very good kind of people, and very rich. Mrs. Tilney was a Miss Drummond, and she and Mrs. Hughes were schoolfellows, and Miss Drummond had a very large fortune, and when she married, her father gave her £20,000 and 500 to buy wedding clothes. Mrs. Hughes saw all the clothes after they came from the warehouse."
Are Mr. and Mrs. Tilney in Bath?
"Yes, I fancy they are, but I am not quite certain. Upon recollection, however, I have a notion they are both dead. At least the mother is. Yes, I am sure Mrs. Tilney is dead, because Mrs. Hughes told me there was a very beautiful set of pearls that Mr. Drummond gave his daughter on her wedding day, and that Miss Tilney has got now, for they were put by for her when her mother died."
And is Mr. Tilney, my partner, the only son?
"I cannot be quite positive about that, my dear. I have some idea he is, but, however, he is a very fine young man, Mrs. Hughes says, and likely to do very well."
Catherine inquired no further. She had heard enough to feel that Mrs. Allen had no real intelligence to give, and that she was most particularly unfortunate herself in having missed such a meeting with both brother and sister. Could she have foreseen such a circumstance, nothing could have persuaded her to go out with the others, and as it was, she could only lament her ill luck and think over what she had lost, till it was clear to her that the drive had by no means been very pleasant, and that John Thorpe himself was quite disagreeable. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Northanger Abbey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. Chapter 10. The Allens, Thorpes, and Morlands all met in the evening at the theatre, and as Catherine and Isabella sat together, there was then an opportunity for the latter to utter some few of the many thousand things which had been collecting within her for communication in the immeasurable length of time which had divided them.
"Oh, heavens, my beloved Catherine, have I got you at last?"
was her address on Catherine's entering the box and sitting by her.
"Now, Mr. Morland."
For he was close to her on the other side.
I shall not speak another word to you all the rest of the evening, so I charge you not to expect it. My sweetest Catherine, how have you been this long age? But I need not ask you, for you look delightfully. You really have done your hair in a more heavenly style than ever. You mischievous creature, do you want to attract everybody? I assure you my brother is quite in love with you already. And as for Mr. Tilney, but that is a settled thing. Even your modesty cannot doubt his attachment now. His coming back to Bath makes it too plain. Oh, what would not I give to see him? I really am quite wild with impatience. My mother says he is the most delightful young man in the world. She saw him this morning, you know. You must introduce him to me. Is he in the house now? Look about, for heaven's sake. I assure you I can hardly exist till I see him.
No,
said Catherine.
he is not here. I cannot see him anywhere.
Oh, horrid! Am I never to be acquainted with him? How do you like my gown? I think it does not look amiss. The sleeves were entirely my own thought. Do you know, I get so immoderately sick of Bath. Your brother and I were agreeing this morning that, although it is vastly well to be here for a few weeks, we would not live here for millions. We soon found out that our tastes were exactly alike in preferring the country to every other place. Really, our opinions were so exactly the same, it was quite ridiculous. There was not a single point in which we differed. I would not have had you by for the world. You are such a sly thing. I'm sure you would have made some droll remark or other about it.
No, indeed, I should not.
Oh, yes, you would indeed. I know you better than you know yourself. You would have told us that we seemed born for each other, or some nonsense of that kind, which would have distressed me beyond conception. My cheeks would have been as red as your roses. I would not have had you by for the world.
Indeed, you do me injustice. I would not have made so improper a remark upon any account. And besides, I am sure it would never have entered my head.
Isabella smiled incredulously, and talked the rest of the evening to James. Catherine's resolution of endeavouring to meet Miss Tilney again continued in full force the next morning, and till the usual moment of going to the pump-room she felt some alarm from the dread of a second prevention. But nothing of that kind occurred. No visitors appeared to delay them, and they all three set off in good time for the pump-room, where the ordinary course of events and conversation took place. Mr. Allen, after drinking his glass of water, joined some gentlemen to talk over the politics of the day, and compare the accounts of their newspapers, and the ladies walked about together, noticing every new face and almost every new bonnet in the room. The female part of the Thorpe family, attended by James Morland, appeared among the crowd in less than a quarter of an hour, and Catherine immediately took her usual place by the side of her friend. James, who was now in constant attendance, maintained a similar position, and separating themselves from the rest of their party, they walked in that manner for some time, till Catherine began to doubt the happiness of a situation which, confining her entirely to her friend and brother, gave her very little share in the notice of either. They were always engaged in some sentimental discussion or lively dispute, but their sentiment was conveyed in such whispering voices, and their vivacity attended with so much laughter, that though Catherine's supporting opinion was not unfrequently called for by one or the other, she was never able to give any, from not having heard a word of the subject. At length, however, she was empowered to disengage herself from her friend by the avowed necessity of speaking to Miss Tilney, whom she most joyfully saw just entering the room with Mrs. Hughes, and whom she instantly joined, with a firmer determination to be acquainted than she might have had courage to command had she not been urged by the disappointment of the day before. Miss Tilney met her with great civility, returned her advances with equal goodwill, and they continued talking together as long as both parties remained in the room, and though in all probability not an observation was made, nor an expression used by either, which had not been made and used some thousands of times before under that roof, in every Bath season, yet the merit of their being spoken with simplicity and truth, and without personal conceit, might be something uncommon.
How well your brother dances!
Was an artless exclamation of Catherine's toward the close of their conversation, which at once surprised and amused her companion.
Henry!
She replied with a smile.
Yes, he does dance very well.
He must have thought it very odd to hear me say I was engaged the other evening, when he saw me sitting down, but I really had been engaged the whole day to Mr. Thorpe.
Miss Tilney could only bow.
You cannot think,
added Catherine after a moment's silence,
how surprised I was to see him again. I felt so sure of his being quite gone away.
When Henry had the pleasure of seeing you before, he was in Bath, but for a couple of days. He came only to engage lodgings for us.
That never occurred to me, and of course, not seeing him anywhere, I thought he must be gone. Was not the young lady he danced with on Monday a Miss Smith?
Yes, an acquaintance of Mrs. Hughes.
I dare say she was very glad to dance. Do you think her pretty?
Not very.
He never comes to the pump room, I suppose?
Yes, sometimes. But he has rid out this morning with my father.
Mrs. Hughes now joined them, and asked Miss Tilney if she was ready to go.
I hope I shall have the pleasure of seeing you again soon,
said Catherine.
Shall you be at the cotillion ball tomorrow?
Perhaps we... Yes, I think we certainly shall.
I am glad of it, for we shall all be there.
This civility was duly returned, and they parted, on Miss Tilney's side, with some knowledge of her new acquaintance's feelings, and on Catherine's without the smallest consciousness of having explained them. She went home very happy. The morning had answered all her hopes, and the evening of the following day was now the object of expectation, the future good. What gown and what headdress she should wear on the occasion became her chief concern. She cannot be justified in it. Dress is at all times a frivolous distinction, and excessive solicitude about it often destroys its own aim. Catherine knew all this very well. Her great-aunt had read her a lecture on the subject only the Christmas before, and yet she lay awake 10 minutes on Wednesday night debating between her spotted and her tamboured muslin, and nothing but the shortness of the time prevented her buying a new one for the evening. This would have been an error in judgment, great, though not uncommon, from which one of the other sex rather than her own, a brother rather than a great-aunt, might have warned her, for man only can be aware of the insensibility of man towards a new gown. It would be mortifying to the feelings of many ladies could they be made to understand how little the heart of man is affected by what is costly or new in their attire, how little it is biassed by the texture of their muslin, and how unsusceptible of peculiar tenderness towards the spotted, the sprigged, the mull, or the jaconet. Woman is fine for her own satisfaction alone. No man will admire her the more, no woman will like her the better for it. Neatness and fashion are enough for the former, and a something of shabbiness or impropriety will be most endearing to the latter. But not one of these grave reflections troubled the tranquillity of Catherine. She entered the rooms on Thursday evening with feelings very different from what had attended her thither the Monday before. She had then been exulting in her engagement to Thorpe, and was now chiefly anxious to avoid his sight, lest he should engage her again, for though she could not, dared not expect that Mr. Tilney should ask her a third time to dance, her wishes, hopes, and plans all centred in nothing less. Every young lady may feel for my heroine in this critical moment, for every young lady has at some time or other known the same agitation. All have been, or at least all have believed themselves to be, in danger from the pursuit of someone whom they wished to avoid, and all have been anxious for the attentions of someone whom they wished to please. As soon as they were joined by the Thorpes, Catherine's agony began. She fidgeted about if John Thorpe came towards her, hid herself as much as possible from his view, and when he spoke to her, pretended not to hear him. The cotillions were over, the country dancing beginning, and she saw nothing of the Tilneys.
"Do not be frightened, my dear Catherine,"
whispered Isabella.
"but I am really going to dance with your brother again. I declare positively it is quite shocking. I tell him he ought to be ashamed of himself, but you and John must keep us in countenance. Make haste, my dear creature, and come to us. John is just walked off, but he'll be back in a moment."
Catherine had neither time nor inclination to answer. The others walked away. John Thorpe was still in view, and she gave herself up for lost. That she might not appear, however, to observe or expect him, she kept her eyes intently fixed on her fan, and a self-condemnation for her folly in supposing that among such a crowd they should even meet with the Tilneys in any reasonable time had just passed through her mind, when she suddenly found herself addressed, and again solicited to dance, by Mr. Tilney himself. With what sparkling eyes and ready motion she granted his request, and with how pleasing a flutter of heart she went with him to the set, may be easily imagined. To escape, and as she believed so narrowly escape, John Thorpe, and to be asked so immediately on his joining her, asked by Mr. Tilney as if he had sought her on purpose. It did not appear to her that life could supply any greater felicity. Scarcely had they worked themselves into the quiet possession of a place, however, when her attention was claimed by John Thorpe, who stood behind her.
"Hey day, Miss Morland,"
said he.
"What is the meaning of this? I thought you and I were to dance together."
I wonder you should think so, for you never asked me.
"That is a good one, by Jove. I asked you as soon as I came into the room, and I was just going to ask you again, but when I turned round you were gone. This is a cursed shabby trick. I only came for the sake of dancing with you, and I firmly believe you are engaged to me ever since Monday. Yes, I remember I asked you while you were waiting in the lobby for your cloak. And here have I been telling all my acquaintance that I was going to dance with the prettiest girl in the room, and when they see you standing up with somebody else, they will quiz me famously."
Oh no, they will never think of me after such a description as that.
"By heavens, if they do not, I will kick them out of the room for blockheads. What chap have you there?"
Catherine satisfied his curiosity.
"Tilney,"
he repeated.
I do not know him. A good figure of a man, well put together. Does he want a horse? Here is a friend of mine, Sam Fletcher, has got one to sell that would suit anybody. A famous clever animal for the road, only 40 guineas. I had 50 minds to buy it myself, for it is one of my maxims always to buy a good horse when I meet with one, but it would not answer my purpose. It would not do for the field. I would give any money for a real good hunter. I have 3 now, the best that ever were backed. I would not take 800 guineas for them. Fletcher and I mean to get a house in Leicestershire against the next season. It is so damned uncomfortable living at an inn."
This was the last sentence by which he could weary Catherine's attention, for he was just then borne off by the resistless pressure of a long string of passing ladies. Her partner now drew near and said,
"That gentleman would have put me out of patience had he stayed with you half a minute longer. He has no business to withdraw the attention of my partner from me. We have entered into a contract of mutual agreeableness for the space of an evening, and all our agreeableness belongs solely to each other for that time. Nobody can fasten themselves on the notice of one without injuring the rights of the other. I consider a country dance as an emblem of marriage. Fidelity and complaisance are the principal duties of both, and those men who do not choose to dance, or marry, themselves, have no business with the partners or wives of their neighbours."
But they are such very different things.
"That you think they cannot be compared together?"
To be sure not. People that marry can never part, but must go and keep house together. People that dance only stand opposite each other in a long room for half an hour.
"And such is your definition of matrimony and dancing. Taken in that light, certainly, their resemblance is not striking, but I think I could place them in such a view. You will allow that, in both, man has the advantage of choice, woman only the power of refusal. That, in both, it is an engagement between man and woman, formed for the advantage of each, and that, when once entered into, they belong exclusively to each other till the moment of its dissolution. That it is their duty, each to endeavour to give the other no cause for wishing that he or she had bestowed themselves elsewhere, and their best interest to keep their own imaginations from wandering towards the perfections of their neighbours, or fancying that they should have been better off with anyone else. You will allow all this?"
Yes, to be sure, as you state it, all this sounds very well, but still they are so very different. I cannot look upon them at all in the same light, nor think the same duties belong to them.
"In one respect, there certainly is a difference. In marriage, the man is supposed to provide for the support of the woman to make the home agreeable to the man. He is to purvey, and she is to smile. But in dancing, their duties are exactly changed. The agreeableness, the compliance, are expected from him, while she furnishes the fan and the lavender water. That, I suppose, was the difference of duties which struck you as rendering the conditions incapable of comparison."
No, indeed, I never thought of that.
"Then I am quite at a loss. One thing, however, I must observe. This disposition on your side is rather alarming. You totally disallow any similarity in the obligations, and may I not thence infer that your notions of the duties of the dancing state are not so strict as your partner might wish? Have I not reason to fear that if the gentleman who spoke to you just now were to return, or if any other gentleman were to address you, there would be nothing to restrain you from conversing with him, as long as you chose?"
Mr. Thorpe is such a very particular friend of my brother's, that if he talks to me, I must talk to him again, but there are hardly 3 young men in the room besides him that I have any acquaintance with."
"And is that to be my only security? Alas! Alas!"
Nay, I am sure you cannot have a better, for if I do not know anybody, it is impossible for me to talk to them, and besides, I do not want to talk to anybody.
Now you have given me a security worth having, and I shall proceed with courage. Do you find Bath as agreeable as when I had the honour of making the inquiry before?
Yes, quite. More so, indeed.
More so. Take care, or you will forget to be tired of it at the proper time. You ought to be tired at the end of 6 weeks.
I do not think I should be tired, if I were to stay here 6 months.
Bath, compared with London, has little variety, and so everybody finds out every year. For 6 weeks, I allow, Bath is pleasant enough, but beyond that it is the most tiresome place in the world. You would be told so by people of all descriptions, who come regularly every winter, lengthen their 6 weeks into 10 or 12, and go away at last because they can afford to stay no longer.
Well, other people must judge for themselves, and those who go to London may think nothing of Bath. But I, who live in a small retired village in the country, can never find greater sameness in such a place as this than in my own home, for here are a variety of amusements, a variety of things to be seen and done all day long, which I can know nothing of there.
You are not fond of the country?
Yes, I am. I have always lived there, and always been very happy. But certainly there is much more sameness in a country life than in a Bath life. One day in the country is exactly like another.
But then you spend your time so much more rationally in the country.
Do I?
Do you not?
I do not believe there is much difference.
Here you are in pursuit only of amusement all day long.
And so I am at home, only I do not find so much of it. I walk about here, and so I do there, but here I see a variety of people in every street, and there I can only go and call on Mrs. Allen.
Mr. Tilney was very much amused.
Only go and call on Mrs. Allen,
he repeated.
What a picture of intellectual poverty. However, when you sink into this abyss again, you will have more to say. You will be able to talk of Bath, and of all that you did here.
Oh, yes, I shall never be in want of something to talk of again to Mrs. Allen, or anybody else. I really believe I shall always be talking of Bath when I am at home again. I do like it so very much. If I could but have Papa and Mamma, and the rest of them here, I suppose I should be too happy. James is coming, my eldest brother, is quite delightful. And especially as it turns out that the very family we are just got so intimate with are his intimate friends already. Oh, who can ever be tired of Bath?
Not those who bring such fresh feelings of every sort to it as you do. But papas and mammas, and brothers, and intimate friends are a good deal gone by to most of the frequenters of Bath, and the honest relish of balls and plays, and everyday sights, is past with them.
Here their conversation closed, the demands of the dance becoming now too importunate for a divided attention. Soon after their reaching the bottom of the set, Catherine perceived herself to be earnestly regarded by a gentleman who stood among the lookers-on immediately behind her partner. He was a very handsome man, of a commanding aspect, past the bloom but not past the vigour of life, and with his eyes still directed towards her, she saw him presently address Mr. Tilney in a familiar whisper. Confused by his notice, and blushing from the fear of its being excited by something wrong in her appearance, she turned away her head. But while she did so, the gentleman retreated, and her partner, coming nearer, said,
I see that you guess what I have just been asked. That gentleman knows your name, and you have a right to know his. It is General Tilney, my father.
Catherine's answer was only,
Oh!
But it was an "oh," expressing everything needful, attention to his words, and perfect reliance on their truth. With real interest and strong admiration did her eye now follow the General as he moved through the crowd, and
How handsome a family they are,
was her secret remark. In chatting with Miss Tilney before the evening concluded, a new source of felicity arose to her. She had never taken a country walk since her arrival in Bath. Miss Tilney, to whom all the commonly frequented environs were familiar, spoke of them in terms which made her all eagerness to know them too, and on her openly fearing that she might find nobody to go with her, it was proposed by the brother and sister that they should join in a walk some morning or other.
I shall like it,
she cried,
beyond anything in the world, and do not let us put it off, let us go tomorrow.
This was readily agreed to, with only a proviso of Miss Tilney's that it did not rain, which Catherine was sure it would not. At 12 o'clock they were to call for her in Pulteney Street, and
Remember, 12 o'clock,
was her parting speech to her new friend. Of her other, her older, her more established friend, Isabella, of whose fidelity and worth she had enjoyed a fortnight's experience, she scarcely saw anything during the evening. Yet, though longing to make her acquainted with her happiness, she cheerfully submitted to the wish of Mr. Allen, which took them rather early away, and her spirits danced within her, as she danced in her chair all the way home. End of Chapter 10.